Rain had a way of making New York feel smaller, like the city was folding in on itself just to keep people close together, whether they wanted to be or not. Lily Brennan pulled her coat tighter and stepped into the warm light spilling out from Marchetti's, a restaurant she could not afford on a night she desperately needed somewhere to sit down and breathe. She had just lost her job. 3 hours ago, her manager at the marketing firm had called her into a glass-walled office and said the word restructuring so gently it almost sounded like an apology, but it wasn't one. It was just a tidy way of saying she no longer had a desk, a paycheck, or a reason to set an alarm in the morning. She'd walked out of that building with a cardboard box of mostly worthless things, a dead succulent, a coffee mug, a photo of her mother. And she had walked for almost 2 miles afterward, because going home to her empty apartment felt like admitting the day was real. Marchetti's wasn't on her way home. Nothing about Marchetti's was on her way to anything. But the windows had glowed gold against the gray evening, and for one reckless, tired moment, she had wanted to sit somewhere warm and pretend, just for 20 minutes, that her life wasn't unraveling. The hostess gave her a look when she walked in, the kind of look that cataloged her damp coat, her flushed face, the absence of a reservation, but didn't turn her away. The dining room was nearly full despite the hour, low conversation humming under soft jazz, candlelight throwing gold across white tablecloths. And there, near the back, was the only empty seat in the entire restaurant that didn't already belong to someone. It was at a table for 2, across from a man already sitting there alone. Lily noticed him the way you notice weather changing before you feel the first drop. Not because he was doing anything, but because of how the room moved around him. 2 men in dark suits stood near the kitchen doors, not eating, not drinking, just watching. The waiter who approached his table did so with his shoulders pulled in slightly, like he was trying to take up less space. Even the couple at the neighboring table kept their voices half a register lower than everyone else's. The man himself looked unbothered by any of it. He sat with his jacket still buttoned, dark hair combed back, one hand resting on the stem of a water glass he hadn't touched. He wasn't extraordinarily tall, wasn't doing anything to draw attention, and yet Lily found her gaze sliding toward him twice, before she even reached the hostess stand the second time, asking, voice embarrassingly unsteady, if there was anywhere she could sit. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. We're completely full," the hostess said, not unkindly, glancing toward the back of the room. "Except..." She hesitated, eyes flicking to the man at the table for 2, then away again, as if even looking at him too long required permission. Lily followed her gaze, and immediately understood the hesitation. She should have walked out right then. She should have stood in the rain a little longer instead. But her feet had carried her halfway across the restaurant before her brain caught up, drawn less by hunger and more by sheer exhaustion, the kind that makes a person reckless without meaning to be. She stopped a few feet from his table. Up close, he looked younger than she'd expected, maybe early 30s. But there was nothing young about the way he held himself, still and economical, like every motion cost something, and he wasn't interested in spending more than necessary. His eyes lifted to her before she'd said a word, and that was somehow worse, because it meant he'd already noticed her standing there, weighing her, before she'd worked up the nerve to speak. "Can I sit with you?" she whispered. It came out smaller than she meant it to. She felt her own cheeks heat with the absurdity of it. A stranger, in a $500 suit, surrounded by men who looked like they removed problems for a living, and she'd just asked to share his dinner like he was an old friend with an extra chair. For a moment, he said nothing. He studied her the way someone studies a weather report that doesn't match the sky outside, assessing, recalibrating. His eyes moved once over her damp hair, the box she still clutched against her hip without realizing it, the rawness in her face that no amount of composure could fully hide. Then, almost imperceptibly, he tilted his head toward the empty chair. "Sit." One word. Low, even, edged with an accent that softened the consonants without weakening them. The two men near the kitchen door shifted, the smaller adjustment of men recalculating a perimeter, and Lily felt it land in her stomach like a stone dropped into still water. The unmistakable sense that something about this had just changed for everyone in the room, not just her. She sat. "Thank you," she said, setting the box down carefully beside her chair, suddenly aware of how it looked. A grown woman carrying her own firing home in a cardboard box, sitting down across from a man who looked like he'd never lost anything in his life. "I know this is strange. I just needed somewhere to sit for a minute. I'll go as soon as—" "You don't have to explain," he said. It wasn't said with warmth exactly, but it wasn't cold either. It had the texture of a closed door that had, for some reason, been left unlocked. Lily found herself staring at him for a beat too long, trying to read something in his face and finding only stillness. The kind of stillness that didn't invite questions. The kind that made the silence feel deliberate rather than awkward. A waiter appeared almost instantly, setting a glass of water in front of her without being asked, refilling the man's untouched glass though it didn't need it, asking in a careful voice if there was anything she wanted. Lily blinked. She hadn't even opened a menu. Water's fine. I'm not really—" She stopped herself, embarrassed. "I don't actually have much of an appetite tonight." The man's gaze flicked briefly toward the cardboard box at her feet. Just once. Just long enough that she realized he'd already drawn his own conclusions about her day, and wasn't going to ask the question out loud. "Bring her the soup," he said to the waiter, without looking away from Lily. "And the bread." "Oh, you don't need to do that," Lily said quickly, feeling heat climb her neck. "I can pay for my own. I know you can." His voice didn't rise, didn't sharpen, but something in it closed the conversation as surely as a hand pressing a door shut. Eat anyway. She didn't know why she didn't argue further. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the strange, unfamiliar relief of being told what to do by someone who seemed utterly certain of the decision, when her entire day had been a series of things falling out of her control. Maybe it was simply that no one had asked her if she was okay all day, and somehow, this stranger, buttoned up and unreadable across a tiny table, was the closest thing to it she'd gotten. "I'm Lily," she offered, because the silence felt like it needed something in it, even if he hadn't asked. He didn't immediately offer his name back. For a few seconds, he simply looked at her, the kind of look that made her feel both entirely seen and completely unknown to him at once. The men by the kitchen door hadn't moved, but she noticed now that one of them had positioned himself slightly differently. Angled, she realized with a small jolt, toward the front entrance, as though the table itself, and the two people sitting at it, had quietly become something to be guarded. "Junho," he said finally. Just the one word, the way he seemed to offer everything, sparingly, like currency he didn't waste. The soup arrived a few minutes later, and Lily ate slowly, aware of how strange it all was. The hush of the restaurant, the quiet authority radiating off the man across from her without a single raised word. The careful way the staff moved around their table like it existed inside its own gravity. She didn't know who he was. She didn't ask, not directly, though the question sat heavy and unspoken between them, mixing with the steam rising off her bowl. What she did know, with a certainty that unsettled her more than it should have, was that something about the rest of her evening, maybe her week, maybe far more than that, had just shifted onto a different path the moment she'd whispered 4 small words to a stranger who hadn't needed to say yes. But he had. And outside, through the rain-streaked window, she caught the reflection of a black car idling at the curb, engine running, 2 more men standing near it with their hands folded and their eyes never quite settling anywhere for long. Waiting, she understood now, for him, for Junho. She didn't know yet what that name meant to the rest of the city. She only knew that when he'd said sit, some old careful part of her, the part that had learned the hard way to read rooms quickly, to sense danger before it had a name, had gone very quiet and very alert at the same time, the way a small animal does when it senses, without yet understanding why, that it has just stepped into the orbit of something far larger than itself. The rain hadn't stopped by the time Lily finished the soup, but something in her chest had eased slightly, the tight knot of the day loosening just enough that she could breathe without it catching. She set her spoon down carefully against the rim of the bowl, aware of Junho watching her with that same unreadable stillness, as if her smallest movements were worth cataloging. "You didn't have to do any of this," she said again, quieter this time, mostly to fill the silence rather than to argue the point. "I know." He said it the same way he'd said it before, not dismissive, just final, like a man who had long ago stopped explaining his own decisions to anyone. A waiter refilled her water glass without being summoned, and Lily noticed, not for the first time, that no one in the restaurant seemed to need to be asked anything at this table. Requests arrived before they were spoken. It should have felt unsettling. Instead, exhausted as she was, it felt almost like being held upright by invisible hands. "Can I ask you something?" she said, emboldened by the warmth in her stomach and the strange, fragile ease of the last few minutes. His eyes lifted to hers. He didn't answer, but he also didn't look away, which she'd already learned was its own kind of permission. "Why did you let me sit here?" The question had been sitting under her tongue since she'd whispered her way into the chair. "You didn't know me. You still don't. I could have been anyone." For a long moment, Junho said nothing. He turned his water glass a quarter turn on the tablecloth, an idle gesture that felt somehow deliberate, like even his stillness had rules. When he finally spoke, his voice was low enough that she had to lean in slightly to catch it over the murmur of the restaurant. "You looked like someone the day had already taken enough from," he said. "I wasn't going to be the one to take a chair, too." It wasn't romantic. It wasn't even particularly kind. Not in the way kindness usually announced itself. But it landed somewhere soft and unguarded in her. A place she hadn't expected a stranger to reach on a night when she'd planned only to disappear quietly into a corner table and lick her wounds alone. "That's a strange way to be generous," she said, and surprised herself by almost smiling. "Generosity isn't usually strange to the person receiving it," Junho said. "Only to the person watching from outside." She didn't fully understand what he meant by that. Not yet. But something about the phrasing made her think he wasn't simply speaking about tonight. There was a weight to his words that suggested years of people watching his choices from outside and deciding without all the facts what kind of man he was. The two men by the kitchen door hadn't moved an inch the entire time, but Lily had begun to notice the rhythm of them now. The way one occasionally murmured something into a small device clipped near his collar, the way the other's eyes swept the room every 90 seconds or so, methodical, unhurried, like a metronome set to threat instead of time. She didn't know exactly what she was looking at. But some old animal instinct, the same one that had gone quiet and alert when he'd first said sit, recognized the shape of it even without a name. "Who are you?" she asked finally, because the soup was gone, and the silence had stretched long enough that the question felt inevitable rather than rude. Junho's gaze didn't waver, but something in his face shifted. Not a flinch, nothing so visible, but a kind of recalibration, as though he were deciding how much of the truth a stranger in a rain-damp coat deserved to carry out of a restaurant with her. "Someone who eats dinner alone most nights," he said. "Tonight, I didn't." It wasn't an answer. She understood that even as she accepted it, the way you accept a locked door isn't going to open just because you're polite about knocking. She didn't push. Some instinct told her that pushing would end the conversation entirely. And for reasons she couldn't fully explain to herself, she didn't want it to end yet. "I lost my job today," she said instead, surprising herself with the honesty of it. She hadn't meant to say it out loud to anyone, let alone a stranger who clearly belonged to a different world than the fluorescent-lit office she'd been escorted out of that afternoon. 11 years. I started right out of college, and today they called it restructuring. Like that makes it easier to hear. It rarely does, Junho said. No, she agreed, looking down at the box still sitting beside her chair, its corners soft with rain. It really doesn't. He didn't offer sympathy in the way people usually did. No soft platitudes about everything happening for a reason. No reflexive, "I'm sorry that meant nothing because it cost nothing." Instead, he watched her for a moment, and then he did something that surprised her more than anything he'd said all evening. He reached over, without asking, and signaled the waiter with 2 fingers raised slightly off the table. "Bring the lamb," he said when the waiter approached. "And whatever she'll actually eat, not just what she'll politely accept." The waiter's eyes flicked toward Lily, faintly amused despite himself, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks again, though this time it wasn't entirely embarrassment. "You don't know what I'll actually eat," she said, half laughing despite the long day weighing on her. "No," Junho agreed. "But you've ordered nothing all night because you didn't want to seem like you were taking advantage of a stranger, so I'm removing the decision from you." It should have annoyed her. The casual assumption, the quiet control of it. But instead, it loosened something in her chest she hadn't realized was still clenched tight since the moment her manager had said the word restructuring. For the first time all day, someone else was making a decision so she didn't have to, and she let it happen, sitting back slightly in her chair as if her body had been waiting for permission to stop holding itself so rigid. They ate in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable, the kind of quiet that exists between 2 people who don't yet know each other well enough to fill every gap with words, but who also don't feel obligated to. Lily found herself studying him in small, careful glances. The way his hands moved with unhurried precision. The way his eyes tracked the room without ever seeming to search it. The faint, old scar along one knuckle that he didn't bother to hide and didn't draw attention to either. "You're staring," he said at one point, not looking up from his plate, and she startled, caught. "Sorry, you're just..." She hesitated, searching for the right word, settling on the most honest one she had. Hard to read. "Good," Junho said. "That's intentional. That's an odd thing to want to be. Not in my line of work." It was the closest he'd come all evening to admitting anything real, and Lily felt the words settle into her like a stone dropped carefully, not thrown, deliberate, but soft enough not to splash. She didn't ask what his line of work was. She had the distinct, uneasy sense that if she asked directly, the warmth of the evening might curdle into something else entirely, something she wasn't ready to face on a night when she'd already lost more than she could afford to lose. Outside, the rain had thickened into a steady, drumming downpour, blurring the street beyond the windows into smears of gold and red light. The black car she'd noticed earlier was still idling at the curb, patient as a held breath, and she watched it for a moment before turning her attention back to the man across from her. "Can I tell you something embarrassing?" she asked, the wine she hadn't ordered but had somehow ended up with loosening her tongue slightly. Junho tilted his head, the faintest invitation. "I almost didn't come in here," she admitted. "I walked past 3 times before I worked up the nerve. I kept thinking, this isn't your kind of place, Lily. Go home. And then I thought about going home to an apartment with unpaid bills on the counter and a job I don't have anymore, and somehow this felt easier." "It's not embarrassing," Junho said. "It's honest. Most people don't manage both at once." "Is that a compliment?" "It's an observation." A pause, brief but deliberate. "Take it as whichever one helps you sleep better tonight." She laughed before she could stop herself, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and for the briefest moment something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but an easing around his eyes, like a door opening half an inch before catching itself and closing again. It was gone almost as soon as she registered it, but she found herself chasing the memory of it anyway, wanting to see it again. The lamb arrived, fragrant and perfectly plated, and Lily ate more than she had in days, The warmth of the food and the strange gravity of the man across from her doing something to quiet the anxious hum that had lived under her skin since the moment she'd been called into that glass-walled office. She didn't know who Junho was, not really. She didn't know why grown men in dark suits watched the door like it owed them something, or why the waitstaff moved like they were navigating around a fault line instead of a dinner table. But she knew, with a clarity that startled her, that she didn't want the evening to end yet. And somewhere beneath that thought, quieter and more dangerous, was the growing, unshakable feeling that whatever Junho was, whatever world he belonged to, some part of him had already decided he didn't want it to end either. When the check came, it wasn't placed near her. It was placed near him. And he didn't so much as glance at the total before sliding a card across the table without breaking eye contact with her. "I should go," Lily said eventually, though she made no move to stand, her body betraying the words even as she spoke them. "It's late. You probably have people waiting." Junho's gaze flicked briefly toward the window, toward the black car and the men standing patiently in the rain beside it. Something in his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, gone before she could be certain she'd seen it at all. "They can wait a little longer," he said. And for reasons she couldn't fully explain to herself, sitting there in the candlelight with a cardboard box of her old life at her feet and a stranger across the table who felt, impossibly, like the only solid thing in a day that had pulled the floor out from under her, Lily believed him. The check disappeared as quickly as it had come, the waiter retrieving Junho's card with a deference that bordered on reverence, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Lily watched the rain trace long, glittering lines down the window beside their table, and she found herself unwilling to break the spell of stillness that had settled over the evening, as fragile as it was. "I really should go," she said again, though her voice carried none of the conviction the words were supposed to hold. "You said that already." Junho's tone wasn't mocking, exactly, but there was something dry beneath it, something that suggested he found her hesitation more interesting than irritating. "I know. I'm working up to actually doing it." That almost smile flickered again at the corner of his mouth, brief as a struck match, gone before she could be sure it had been there at all. He rose from his chair without hurry, buttoning his jacket properly, and the movement rippled outward through the restaurant like a stone dropped in still water. The two men by the kitchen door straightened. The hostess's eyes flicked toward the front entrance. Even the bartender across the room seemed to recalibrate his posture without consciously deciding to. Lily stood too, suddenly aware of how small she felt beside him, not in height. He wasn't significantly taller than her, but in the way space itself seemed to defer to him, parting and reassembling around his presence like water around a stone. "Let me walk you out," he said. It wasn't quite a question, but it wasn't an order either. Somewhere in between, a courtesy extended with the quiet expectation that it would be accepted. "You don't have to." "I'm aware." He picked up her cardboard box before she could reach for it herself, tucking it against one arm, with an ease that suggested he'd carried far heavier things without complaint. "I'm doing it anyway." She didn't argue. Some small, traitorous part of her didn't want to. Outside, the rain had softened into a fine mist, the kind that didn't so much fall as hang suspended in the orange glow of the streetlights. The black car was still there, engine idling, the two men beside it falling into position the moment the restaurant door opened. One moving toward the car, the other scanning the street in a slow, deliberate arc that reminded Lily uncomfortably of the way security guards moved in movies, except this didn't feel like a movie. This felt unsettlingly, immediately real. "Is that your car?" she asked, mostly to have something to say, because the silence between them had become a living thing she didn't quite know how to hold. "It's a car," Junho said, which wasn't really an answer, but she'd already begun to understand that most things he said operated on at least two levels, and she rarely had access to both. A taxi idled at the corner, its yellow light glowing through the mist, and Lily started toward it instinctively, the box still in Junho's arms, forcing her to half-turn back toward him. "I can take it from here," she said. "Thank you. For all of this. I don't even know how to—" "You don't have to thank me again." He held the box out to her, and when she reached for it, his fingers brushed against hers for the briefest moment. Not lingering, not deliberate, just the accidental geometry of an object changing hands. But she felt it anyway, a small current that ran up her arm and settled somewhere in her chest, foolish and unbidden. Right. She took the box, suddenly very aware of her own damp hair, her tired eyes, the version of herself that had walked into Marchetti's 2 hours ago, wanting nothing more than somewhere warm to sit. "Well, good night, Junho." She turned toward the taxi, and she had almost reached it, her hand actually on the cold metal of the door handle, when she heard footsteps behind her on the wet pavement, unhurried, and a voice low enough that it seemed meant only for her. "Lily." She turned. He was closer than she expected, close enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to hold his gaze, and for the first time all evening, something in his expression had shifted into territory she didn't have a name for yet. Not quite concern, not quite something softer than that, but adjacent to both. "You don't have anywhere to go tonight, do you?" he said. It wasn't framed as a question. It was a statement, delivered with the same flat certainty he seemed to apply to everything, but there was something underneath it that made her chest tighten. "I have an apartment," she said, too quickly, too defensively. "That's not what I asked." She opened her mouth to argue, to insist that she was fine, that she'd manage, that strangers, however kind, however unsettling in their quiet authority, didn't get to ask her questions like that after one dinner. But the truth sat heavy and undeniable in her throat. She did have an apartment, but the lease was 3 weeks from ending and she had no job to renew it with. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a small, exhausted voice had been quietly calculating how many days of savings she actually had left, and the number wasn't generous. "I'll figure it out," she said instead, which was true, and also not an answer. Junho studied her for a long moment, the mist gathering faintly in his dark hair, and she had the strange sensation of being weighed again, the way he had weighed her the moment she'd asked to sit at his table, assessing, recalibrating, deciding something she wasn't privy to. "There's a place," he said finally. "Not far. Safe. No strings." That's exactly what someone with strings would say. The corner of his mouth twitched again, that same flicker of almost amusement. "Fair. I appreciate it, I really do. But I don't know you, Junho. I don't know anything about you except that you eat dinner alone and apparently travel with what looks like a small army." She gestured vaguely toward the men by the car, who hadn't moved, hadn't reacted, but whose attention she could feel anyway, like heat radiating off a stove even from across a room. "That's not exactly a foundation for trust." "No," he agreed. "It isn't. So why does it feel like you expect me to trust you anyway?" For the first time, something like genuine consideration crossed his face, as if her question had actually required him to think, rather than simply respond. "I don't expect it," he said eventually. "I'm only offering it. What you do with the offer is yours." It was, she realized, the most honest thing anyone had said to her all day. More honest, in its strange, careful way, than the corporate apology that had ended her career that afternoon. More honest than the landlord's increasingly terse texts about next month's rent. Junho wasn't promising her anything. He wasn't pretending the offer came without complications. He was simply placing it in front of her and letting her decide, the way he'd let her decide whether to sit down at his table in the first place. "I have a friend," she said slowly. "In Queens. I can stay with her tonight." It wasn't entirely a lie. Maya existed, and the friendship was real, even if Lily hadn't spoken to her in almost 2 months. and the idea of showing up at midnight with a cardboard box and a humiliating story about being fired felt almost worse than facing her own empty apartment alone. Junho's eyes held hers for a moment longer, and she had the distinct impression that he knew, with unsettling precision, that she was hedging. But he didn't push. He simply nodded once, a small, economical movement, and stepped back to allow her room to open the taxi door. "Take this," he said, and before she could protest, he'd pressed something small and rectangular into her free hand. A card, plain black, with nothing on it but a phone number embossed in silver. "If the friend in Queens doesn't work out, or if anything else doesn't work out." "Junho, I can't—" "You can," he said. "You just haven't decided to yet." She stared at the card, then up at him, and something about the simplicity of the gesture. No name, no logo, no explanation. Just a number and the quiet expectation that she might need it. Undid something in her composure that the entire exhausting day hadn't managed to touch. Her eyes stung, unexpectedly, and she blinked hard against it, embarrassed. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be. "Really? You don't know me. People like you don't just—" "People like me," he repeated. And there was something in the way he said it, quiet and deliberate, that made her realize she'd touched on something true without fully understanding what it was. "You don't know what people like me do." "No," she admitted. "I don't." "Then don't assume." It wasn't sharp, but it carried weight, the first real edge she'd heard in his voice all evening, gone again almost as quickly as it appeared. He stepped back, putting proper distance between them, as though he'd allowed himself closer than intended, and was now correcting for it. "Get home safe, Lily." She climbed into the taxi on legs that felt strangely unsteady, the card still clutched in her hand, the cardboard box settled awkwardly across her lap. Through the rain-streaked window, she watched him stand on the curb a moment longer than necessary, watched the two men fall into step beside him as he turned toward the black car, watched the particular way the street seemed to exhale once he was finally gone from it, as if it had been holding something tense the entire time he stood there. The taxi pulled away, and Lily turned the card over in her fingers, running her thumb along the embossed numbers, trying to make sense of the last 2 hours, and finding that she couldn't, not entirely. She had walked into Marchetti's a woman who had lost her job, her routine, her sense of who she was supposed to be tomorrow morning. She walked out of it carrying a phone number from a man whose name she barely knew, attached to a kindness she couldn't fully trust, and couldn't quite dismiss either. She didn't go to Maya's that night. She went home, to the apartment with the unpaid bills stacked neatly on the kitchen counter, and she sat on the edge of her bed for a long time without turning on the lights, the city's glow seeping in through the blinds in thin amber stripes across the floor. She thought about the way Junho had looked at her across the table, not with hunger or performance, but with something steadier, something that felt almost like attention being paid for its own sake, rather than for anything it might earn him. She thought about the men who hadn't moved from their posts the entire dinner, about the hostess's careful eyes, about the way an entire restaurant full of strangers had organized itself, invisibly, around the gravity of one quiet man at a corner table. She thought about the word strings, and the way he hadn't denied having any, only promised this particular offer didn't come with them. It was nearly 1 a.m. when her phone buzzed against the nightstand. A text, from a number she didn't recognize, though some instinct told her exactly who it was before she even unlocked the screen. "Did you make it home?" No punctuation at the end, not quite a question, more like a fact he wanted confirmed. Lily stared at the words for a long moment, her thumb hovering over the screen, weighing the strange intimacy of being checked on by a man she'd known for 2 hours against the unsettling reality of how he'd gotten her number in the first place. Because she certainly hadn't given it to him. "How did you get this number?" she typed back. The reply came almost instantly. "You're not the only one who can find things out." That's not reassuring. It wasn't meant to be reassuring. It was meant to be true. Despite herself, despite the exhaustion and the strangeness, and the small, persistent voice in the back of her mind, warning her that this, whatever this was moving faster and stranger than anything in her carefully ordinary life had ever moved before, Lily felt the corner of her mouth lift. "Yes," she typed finally. "I made it home. Good." A pause. The little dots appearing and disappearing twice before his next message finally came through, and when it did, it sat differently in her chest than anything else he'd said all night. Quieter, heavier, the kind of sentence that didn't ask to be answered so much as it asked to be carried. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow will look different." She didn't know, lying there in the dark with her phone glowing faintly against her palm, just how right he would turn out to be, or how completely, how irrevocably different would come to mean. She only knew that for the first time since the word restructuring had been spoken in a glass-walled office that afternoon, something in her chest had eased enough to let her finally close her eyes. Outside, 3 blocks away, in a high-floor office with the city spread out beneath it like scattered embers, Yunyo stood at the window with his phone still in hand, the screen dark now, her last reply already memorized. One of his men stood near the door, waiting, the kind of patient silence that men in his employ had learned not to interrupt. "Find out everything about her," Junho said finally, without turning around. Quietly. "I want to know if anyone else is watching her too. Should we be concerned, sir?" Junho didn't answer right away. Below him, the city glittered on, indifferent and enormous, full of people who would never know his name, and a handful who knew it far too well. He thought of the woman who had whispered 4 words to him across a restaurant, who hadn't known who he was, who hadn't flinched the way most people did once they figured it out, because she hadn't figured it out yet, not really, not fully. "No," he said finally. "Not concerned." He didn't say the rest of it out loud, that something about the careful, unguarded way she'd looked at him, like he was simply a tired man who'd shared his dinner, and not the thing the rest of the city quietly feared, had settled into his chest like a held breath finally released. He didn't say that he intended to keep her safe whether she asked him to or not, that the men who would, inevitably, eventually try to use her against him would find that decision costing them everything they had. He only turned from the window finally and said, "Just watch her, carefully, and tell no one why." 3 days passed before Lily heard from him again, and in that time, the strange warmth of that night at Marchetti's had begun to feel almost unreal, like something she'd invented to get herself through a particularly bad week. She'd gone to 2 job interviews that left her feeling smaller each time, sent out 11 more applications into a silence that seemed to swallow them whole, and counted her remaining savings twice, hoping the second count might be kinder than the first. It wasn't. She hadn't texted Junho again after that first night. She'd told herself it was because she didn't want to seem desperate, didn't want to be the woman who'd latched onto a stranger's kindness in a moment of weakness, and mistaken it for something it wasn't. But the black card sat propped against the lamp on her nightstand, where she could see it every night before sleep, and more than once she'd picked up her phone with his name half-typed before deleting it, embarrassed at her own hesitation. It was Thursday evening, gray and unremarkable, when she stepped out of her apartment building to find a man she didn't recognize standing near the entrance, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark coat too well tailored for the neighborhood, his eyes finding her immediately in a way that made her stomach drop. "Ms. Brennan." His voice was polite, even gentle, but there was no mistaking the formality of it, the sense that he'd rehearsed this exact greeting. "Mr. Park asked me to make sure you arrived safely to your appointment." "What appointment?" Lily asked, glancing past him toward the street, half expecting to see the black car from that night, and finding it there, exactly where her instinct had told her it would be. "The interview. Riverside Media. 2 o'clock. She stared at him. She did, in fact, have an interview at Riverside Media at 2 o'clock. a position she'd applied for 4 days ago on a whim, never expecting to hear back given how competitive the marketing field had become since her layoff. She hadn't told anyone about it. Not Maya, not her mother, certainly not a man she'd met once over a bowl of soup. "How does he know about that?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. The man, Junho's man, she understood now, though she still didn't have his name, shifted slightly, the practiced neutrality of someone who'd been trained not to answer certain questions. "I was only asked to drive you, ma'am. If you'd prefer to take your own transportation, that's entirely your choice." It should have unsettled her more than it did. A man she'd shared one dinner with somehow knew about a job interview she hadn't mentioned to a single living soul, had sent a driver to her apartment without asking, had apparently been quietly tracking the shape of her week without her ever feeling watched. And yet, standing there on the sidewalk with her interview suit slightly too snug from weeks of stress eating and her confidence hanging by threads, she found herself oddly unbothered by the invasion, almost grateful for it, the way you're grateful for a guardrail on a road you didn't realize was so narrow until you saw the edge of it. "Does he do this for everyone he has dinner with?" she asked, mostly to herself, as she walked toward the car. "No, ma'am," the driver said, opening the door for her. "He doesn't." The interview went better than any of the others. She didn't know if it was the confidence boost of arriving in a car that practically radiated importance, or simply that the universe had decided to throw her a single modest bone after a brutal couple of weeks. But the hiring manager seemed genuinely engaged, asking follow-up questions instead of glancing at the clock, and when Lily left the building 40 minutes later, she felt something she hadn't felt since the day she'd been let go: cautious, fragile hope. The same car was waiting at the curb. "He said you might want to ride back," the driver explained, as if reading the question on her face before she'd asked it. She didn't argue this time. She climbed in, and somewhere around the second red light, her phone buzzed. "How did it go?" She smiled before she could stop herself, typing back. "How do you already know I had an interview today?" "I asked a question." "You're avoiding it." "Fine." "It went well." "I think." "Good. You deserved a good day." She stared at the message for a long moment, something warm and unfamiliar unfurling in her chest, before she typed back, more honestly than she meant to. "Why does it feel like you're keeping tabs on me?" The reply took longer this time. When it came, it was simple, almost disarmingly so. "Because I am." That's supposed to make me feel better? No, it's supposed to be true. I told you, I don't waste time pretending things are softer than they are. She didn't know how to respond to that, so she didn't, watching the city slide past the window instead, gray buildings catching the last orange light of the afternoon. But when she got home that night, she found herself sitting on the edge of her bed again, phone in hand, typing and deleting several messages before finally settling on one she could send without flinching. "Can I see you again? Not because I need anything, just because I want to." The reply came almost instantly, faster than she expected, as if he'd been waiting for exactly that question. "Tomorrow. I'll send a car." He took her to a place far quieter than Marchetti's the following evening. A small, unmarked restaurant tucked behind an unassuming door in a part of the city she didn't recognize, where the owner greeted Junho by name and ushered them to a private room without being asked. The men who'd flanked him at dinner before were absent this time, though Lily had the distinct sense, walking through the building, that absence didn't mean they weren't somewhere close. "This feels different," she said, once they were seated. The door closed behind them, the noise of the main dining room muffled to almost nothing. "It is different." He didn't elaborate immediately, pouring tea for both of them with the same economical precision he brought to everything. "Marchetti's was public. This isn't. Is that your way of saying I've been promoted?" The almost smile again, quicker this time, like it was becoming easier for him to let it show. "Something like that." They talked more that night than they had during their entire first dinner. Not about his work, which he still deflected with the same practiced ease, but about smaller things. The apartment she'd grown up in outside Philadelphia, the way her mother had taught her to cook by instinct rather than recipe, the year she'd spent considering law school before deciding marketing felt more honest, somehow, even if it paid less. Junho listened in a way few people had ever listened to her, fully, without glancing at his phone, without performing the polite half-attention most people offered while waiting for their turn to speak. "You don't talk about yourself," she observed, halfway through the meal, watching him deflect yet another question with practiced grace. "There's not much worth telling." "I don't believe that." "You don't have to." He set down his chopsticks, studying her with that same unreadable stillness she'd come to find less unsettling and more familiar with each meeting. "But some things, once you know them, you can't unknow. I'd rather you have more good days before that happens." It should have frightened her more than it did, the implication sitting heavy and obvious in the space between them. The unmistakable sense that whatever Junho was, whatever world surrounded him with silent men and unmarked restaurants and the kind of authority that made entire rooms recalibrate their posture, it was not a small or simple thing. But some reckless, exhausted part of her, the same part that had whispered 4 words to a stranger over soup 3 weeks ago, decided in that moment that she would rather have the good days now and face the rest of it later, whatever later turned out to mean. "What if I want to know now?" she asked quietly. Junho's expression didn't change, not exactly, but something behind his eyes shifted, weighing her question with the same care he seemed to weigh everything. "Then I'll tell you," he said. "But not tonight. Tonight I'd like you to just have a good day a little longer." She let it go, not because she'd stopped wanting the truth, but because the way he'd said it, careful, almost protective, as if he genuinely wanted to shield her from something rather than simply withhold it, made her trust him a little more, not less. It was nearly 2 weeks later, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, that the fragile piece of those good days finally cracked. Lily was walking to a coffee shop near her new job. Riverside Media had hired her, the offer arriving exactly 9 days after that quiet dinner, and she'd allowed herself, cautiously, to believe her life was stitching itself back together, when a man she didn't recognize fell into step beside her, too close, his hand closing around her upper arm before she'd even registered him as a threat. "You've been spending time with someone you shouldn't," the man said, low and fast, his grip tightening when she tried to pull away. "Junho Park needs to remember he's not the only one with reach in this city. Tell him Daniel Cho says hello." Fear moved through her like cold water, sudden and complete, and for a moment she couldn't speak, couldn't think past the bruising pressure of his fingers and the calm, terrible certainty in his voice. But before she could even decide whether to scream, a black car she hadn't noticed approaching screeched to the curb beside them, and 2 men were out of it before it had fully stopped, one pulling the stranger off her with brutal efficiency, the other stepping between Lily and the confrontation entirely, shielding her with his own body. "Ms. Brennan, get in the car," the second man said, his voice tight with urgency, but carefully controlled. "Now, please." She didn't argue. Her legs were shaking too hard to consider arguing. As the car pulled away, she looked back once and saw the stranger, Daniel Cho. He'd called himself, being held against the brick wall of a building, speaking rapidly into the face of the man restraining him, though she couldn't hear the words from inside the car. Her phone was already ringing by the time they merged onto the avenue. Junho's name on the screen, and when she answered, her voice came out smaller and more frightened than she wanted it to. "Are you hurt?" His voice was different than she'd ever heard it. Not loud, never loud, but underneath the careful control was something taut and dangerous, like a wire pulled to its absolute limit. No, I'm okay, Her voice cracked. "Junho, who was that? He knew your name. He said—" "I know what he said." A pause, and she could hear him moving, could hear the muffled sound of a door closing somewhere on his end. "I need you to listen to me carefully, Lily. I'm sending you somewhere safe, and I need you to stay there until I come for you myself. Can you do that?" "You're scaring me." "I know." His voice gentled, just slightly. The first real crack of vulnerability she'd heard from him since the night they'd met. "I'm sorry. I should have told you sooner. I should have protected you from even knowing this existed. But I need you safe right now, and I promise you, Lily, I will explain everything. Tonight. In person. You'll have every answer you've wanted." She closed her eyes, the city blurring past the window, her pulse still hammering from the stranger's grip on her arm. And somewhere beneath the fear, she felt something else settle into place. Not relief exactly, but the beginning of it. The sense that the truth, however dangerous, was finally close enough to reach. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll stay. Good." A pause, heavy with everything he wasn't saying yet. "Nothing happens to you. Do you understand me?" "Nothing." And for the first time since that rain-soaked night at Marchetti's, Lily heard unmistakably beneath the careful control of his voice something that sounded almost like fear. Not for himself, she realized with a jolt that settled deep in her chest, but entirely, completely, for her. The safe house, if that was even the right word for it, turned out to be a quiet brownstone on a tree-lined street in a part of the city Lily had never had reason to visit. A woman named Grace let her in, calm and efficient, offering tea. Lily didn't drink, and a blanket she wrapped around her shoulders anyway. More for the comfort of the gesture than the chill. 2 men stood near the front windows, not pretending to do anything else, and Lily sat on the edge of a couch that felt too soft for how rigid her body still was, replaying the stranger's grip on her arm, the calm cruelty in his voice, the way he'd said Junho's full name like a threat dressed up as a greeting. It was nearly 9 that night when she heard the front door open, and she was on her feet before she'd consciously decided to stand, some instinct pulling her toward the sound of his voice in the hallway, low and urgent, speaking to Grace in clipped, efficient sentences she couldn't quite make out. Then he was in the doorway, and the moment he saw her, something in his controlled posture broke, just slightly. Not dramatically. Not in any way the average person would have caught, but Lily had spent enough hours studying his stillness by now to recognize the absence of it. He crossed the room in a few quick strides and stopped just short of her, his hands coming up as though to touch her face, her arms, anywhere that might confirm she was unharmed, before he seemed to catch himself and let them fall. "You're all right," he said, and it wasn't quite a question. "I'm all right," she confirmed, and the relief that washed visibly through him told her, more clearly than any words could have, exactly how frightened he'd actually been. "Sit," he said, gentler than he'd ever said the word before. And this time she understood. It wasn't an order so much as a plea disguised as one. They sat together on the too soft couch, and for a long moment, Junho said nothing at all, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed somewhere past her shoulder, as though gathering the courage for something he'd clearly been rehearsing the entire drive over. "I run an organization," he said finally. "You'd call it organized crime. I won't insult you by calling it anything softer than that." Lily's breath caught, though some part of her had already known. Had known since the first night at Marchetti's, when an entire restaurant had reorganized itself around his presence without a single raised voice. Hearing it stated plainly was different than suspecting it, though. Heavier, more real, more dangerous. "My family has run parts of this city for almost 30 years, he continued, his voice steady, even as his hands, resting on his knees, betrayed the faintest tension. "I inherited responsibilities I didn't choose, and I've spent most of my adult life trying to keep that world as far from ordinary people as I possibly can. Daniel Cho runs a rival organization, He's wanted territory my family has held for decades, and he's smart enough to know that hurting someone close to me would hurt me far more than any business dispute ever could. So he came after me to get to you. Yes. The word came out flat, almost ashamed. And that is entirely my fault. I should have kept my distance the moment I realized what you meant to me. Instead, I let myself believe I could have something normal alongside everything else. And you nearly paid for that mistake today. Lily studied him for a long moment. This man who'd never once raised his voice in her presence, who'd fed her soup on the worst night of her life, and quietly tracked her job interviews and sent cars to keep her safe without ever once asking for anything in return, and she felt something settle in her chest that surprised her with its clarity. You didn't make a mistake, she said. He did. The choice to hurt people isn't yours, Junho. It's his. That's a generous way to look at it. Maybe, but it's the true way. She reached over, covering his hand with hers, and felt him go very still, the way he always did right before he allowed himself to feel something fully. I'm not going to pretend I'm not scared. I am. What happened today terrified me. But I've watched you for weeks now, and I've never once seen you use any of this, whatever this is, to hurt anyone undeserving of it. You've only used it to protect. That won't always be enough to keep you safe. Then let's figure out what will be, she said simply. Together. Not you deciding alone what I can handle. Something in his face shifted then, the careful control finally giving way to something rawer underneath. Not weakness, she understood immediately, but the particular vulnerability of a man unaccustomed to sharing decisions with anyone, choosing, deliberately, to share this one with her. Daniel Cho will be dealt with, he said quietly. Not through violence beyond what's necessary to ensure he never comes near you again. I won't lie to you about what that requires, but I won't let it become more than it has to be either. The authorities already have enough on him to ensure his own organization collapses without my involvement showing on any paper trail. I've spent years building exactly enough distance for exactly this kind of situation. And after that? After that, Junho said, I'd like to stop pretending I can give you a normal life, because I can't. But I can give you an honest one. Full protection, full truth, and the choice, every single day, of whether that's enough for you to stay. Lily thought of the cardboard box she'd carried out of her old office weeks ago, of the version of herself who'd walked into Marchetti's wanting nothing more than somewhere warm to sit for 20 minutes. She thought of every careful, contained kindness Junho had shown her since. The soup, the silent observation, the black card with nothing but a number on it, the fear in his voice that morning that he hadn't quite managed to hide. She thought of his hand still resting beneath hers, steady now, the storm in him settling the longer she stayed exactly where she was. I'm staying, she said. Not because I don't understand what that means, because I do. And I'm choosing it anyway. 3 weeks later, the city had quietly absorbed the disappearance of Daniel Cho's operation, the way it absorbed most things. A few lines in the back pages of a newspaper about a federal investigation into organized racketeering. No names that meant anything to ordinary readers. No connection drawn to a man named Junho Park who continued to eat dinner, occasionally, at a small Italian restaurant called Marchetti's, always at the same corner table. Lily sat across from him there on a Friday evening, 6 months almost to the day, since she'd whispered 4 nervous words to a stranger she hadn't known was the most powerful man in the city. The hostess greeted her by name now. The waiter brought her wine without asking, the way he'd once brought soup to a woman who hadn't ordered anything at all. You're staring again, Junho said, not looking up from the menu, though the corner of his mouth had given up pretending not to smile months ago. I'm allowed to stare at my own boyfriend, she said, testing the word the way she still sometimes did, half expecting it to feel strange and finding, instead, that it fit better every time she used it. Is that what I am now? You've been driving me to work for 5 months and you still ask me that. I like hearing you say it. He set the menu down, reaching across the small table to take her hand, an easy, unguarded gesture that would have seemed impossible the first night she'd met him, when even his stillness had felt like a closed door. I like a great many things I didn't expect to like, since the night you sat down across from a stranger and decided, for some reason, to trust him. I didn't trust you, Lily said, smiling. Not that first night. I just didn't have anywhere else to sit. And now? She looked at him. Really looked. The way she had that very first evening, cataloging the stillness in him that had once seemed like danger, and now simply felt like home. The quiet authority that no longer unsettled her because she understood, finally and completely, exactly what it protected rather than what it threatened. Now, she said, I think I've found exactly where I'm supposed to sit. Outside, the city moved on around them, indifferent to the quiet, careful peace that had settled over one corner table in an ordinary restaurant. A peace built not on the absence of danger, but on the steady, unwavering choice of two people who had decided, deliberately and completely, to face whatever came next together. The rain had long since stopped. The black car still waited at the curb, patient as ever, but for the first time, Lily understood it wasn't a symbol of something to fear. It was simply a sign that she was, finally and irrevocably, home.